In the 8th chapter of the book of Acts, we see the account of a Christ follower by the name of Philip. Although he had been driven out of Jerusalem by the persecution of a man named Saul, his new ministry in Samaria was flourishing. You see, Philip was a God-saturated man. And you know, with all the emptiness in our world, as it was in Philip's world, that when a man has been around God, people long to be around that man. So the crowds were gathering with enthusiasm to hear the message of Philip. But then something inexplicable happens, and Philip's story takes a dramatic change. God does something that makes no sense. He calls Philip to go to a hard place. You see, as the account unfolds, an angel comes to Philip and tells him to leave his successful ministry in the city of Samaria and travel down a road that goes through a desert between Jerusalem and Gaza. Now, this unusual command should get our attention. God calls him to go away from success to a difficult situation. This is not how we think that life should work, and certainly not how we think ministry should work. As human beings, we will always choose comfort over difficulty. But God is calling Philip away from the crowds to a place where he would likely encounter no one. And to make matters more challenging, he is told to simply go, with no reason given as to why he is going. But this is where the story should get our attention. Philip doesn't question the call. He doesn't even ask God, why are you asking me to go? He literally, in the account, says nothing, and he starts walking down that lonely road. Now, I want us to pause for a moment and put ourselves in Philip's shoes. How upset would you be if God took you away from something you loved or some place you wanted to be to go to somewhere that didn't make any sense? We would most likely demand an explanation before we accepted the mission. I'll go, God, but you better give me a good reason why I should go. You see, here is what we must remember. The story of our lives is not our story. It's God's story. This was God's story. It wasn't Philip's story. He didn't owe Philip an explanation, and he doesn't owe us any explanation for what he does with us and why he does things in our lives. And here's why. I want you to hear this. God's job is not to manage our agenda. Instead, God has graciously invited us to be a part of His. He doesn't ask us to contribute to His work. He invites us to participate with Him in His work. You see, this story reveals that Philip has been invited to be a part of something that is dramatically bigger than Philip could have ever imagined. As he walks along the desolate road from Jerusalem to Gaza, he encounters a very powerful court official of the Ethiopian queen, Candace. This man was responsible for all of the queen's treasure. And as Philip and the Ethiopian cross paths, Philip has no idea that God was not sending Philip to a place when he told him to leave Samaria. He was sending him to a person who needed to hear about Christ. You see, this man is the reason for Philip's journey. God manufactured all of the details of this encounter to bring this Ethiopian man to Christ. Now, it may be true that Philip wanted to preach to the crowds in Samaria, but God was working on the heart of a man in the desert. So for the sake of a seeking Ethiopian, God radically altered Philip's story. This is a powerful truth. God is orchestrating our lives for His glory and for our good. He's not too busy with the big stuff, but He is also intimately working in all of the little stuff, all of the little details of our lives. Let me tell you that from personal experience, every person who has ever followed God's call can relate to this. God often does the inexplicable. He calls us to go to places and to do things that, humanly speaking, they make no sense. But God always has a reason for what He does, and it's far more glorious and majestic than we will ever know. but that doesn't make it easy. Like Philip, leaving the crowds for the desert can leave you isolated, alone, and often with more questions than answers. God has a purpose, but we don't always know why. And we don't always understand how that purpose works. As one who has experienced both the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat in ministry, I've traveled that lonely road. Every minister has. Every person who has been called has. But God has given me a heart to come alongside those who are also traveling that road. You see, our mission at E2 is to encourage and to equip those who follow God's calling. Many who do so in difficult and in isolated places. Many of them, you'll never know their names. You'll never see their faces. This past year has been tough on pastors and church leaders, both here in the United States and around the world. And it's been tougher than most people realize. The pandemic has taken its toll. More than just sickness, emotionally, spiritually, physically. And we desire at E2 to do all that we can to help keep them going, to keep walking down the pathways that God has put before them. Would you commit to pray with us at E2 for these leaders? Again, you may not see their faces, you may not know their names, but you can walk with them as you lift their names to the Lord in prayer. Would you also join us as a financial ministry partner at E2 so that we can go to as many of them as possible to keep them both encouraged and equipped for the work God has called them to do? Now, I want to close with a very specific request. You see, we often think of the ministry as the leaders leading those ministries, and they're the ones who need encouragement. But let me remind you how their families need encouragement also. Last year, I was able to travel to southern India to see firsthand the work of a medical doctor whose name is Kola. For years, through the Center of Global Ministries, Pastor Chris, I call him, not just Dr. Chris, traveled from village to village, treating people, helping them medically at no cost to the people in those villages. And at the same time, he was sharing the gospel, he was planting churches, he was doing the work of an evangelist. I love Chris Kola, and God gave me a heart for the work that Chris had for the heart of the people in southern India. This last year during the pandemic, Chris traveled from village to village, reminding people of the importance of taking care of themselves in the midst of a pandemic, and at the same time of sharing the gospel, treating people with COVID. Just this last week, we received word that COVID caught up with Chris, and Chris went into the hospital, and God took Chris home to heaven. Chris is now with the Lord, and he's received the fruit of his labors. But his wife Lakshmi and his daughters Sarah and Jemima must go forward. The work that Chris established is now fulfilled in Chris's reward in heaven. But the work on earth continues. And so I want to ask you if you would pray for the Kola family, for Lakshmi, for Sarah, for Jemima. Maybe you're even moved to contribute to their ongoing needs in the future. There are so many uncertainties for this family. And you'll send us a message at E2. We would love the opportunity to connect you with the Center for Global Ministries where you can help support this family. God has a purpose. He called Chris to a difficult ministry, and now he's called Chris home. And we're praying that God will raise up another Chris Kola in that strategic area so that we might continue to see God's church grow and we might continue to see the ministry expand. Pray for that family. Join with us as we do. All over the world, leaders need encouragement. They need to be equipped. They're traveling down difficult highways, but God has a purpose just like He did in Philip's life. And God has called us to come alongside of them. We covet your prayers as E2 ministry partners. We covet your financial support. And we pray that as long as we have breath in life, we might come and walk alongside the Philips all over the world who have been called to do God's work.